Welcome back to Trending Update USA. This is your home for the biggest stories, bold reactions, and deep dives into the world of sports. And I'm Steffan, thrilled to have you with us today as we unpack one of the most talked about comments coming from one of tennis's brightest young superstars. Coco Gauff, a Grand Slam champion, global icon, and the face of a new generation in women's tennis, has made headlines again, not for a match result, not for a trophy, but for what she openly described as crazy about the Australian Open when compared to the other three Grand Slam tournaments, and her words are sparking conversations all across the tennis world. Coco Gauff has played on the biggest stages in tennis from a remarkably young age. From her breakout moment at Wimbledon as a teenager to lifting the US Open trophy in front of a roaring home crowd, she has experienced the pressure, excitement, and intensity that only Grand Slam tennis can bring. The Australian Open, Wimbledon, the French Open, and the US Open each carry their own traditions, surfaces, atmospheres, and unique challenges. Yet when Coco Gauff recently reflected on the Australian Open experience, she didn't hesitate to point out just how different, and in her words, crazy, it feels compared to the rest. For Gauff, the Australian Open stands apart from the very beginning. It is the first Grand Slam of the season, arriving in January when players are still adjusting to the rhythm of competition after a short off-season. Bodies are fresh, expectations are high, and everyone arrives with hope that this could be their year. Coco has spoken about how mentally strange it can feel to play such a massive tournament right at the start of the calendar, when players are still finding their form. Unlike the French Open or Wimbledon, where the season has already developed a storyline, Australia feels like a reset button for the entire tour. What Coco finds especially wild is how the Australian Open combines this sense of new beginnings with some of the harshest playing conditions in the sport. Melbourne's extreme heat is legendary, and Gauff has been very open about how physically demanding it is to compete under those conditions. While the US Open also brings heat and humidity, Coco has said there is something uniquely draining about the Australian summer. Matches can stretch late into the night, temperatures can swing dramatically, and recovery becomes just as important as performance on the court. She has pointed out that at no other Grand Slam do players talk as much about heat management, ice vests, cooling breaks, and scheduling as they do in Australia. For a young athlete who takes fitness and preparation seriously, this constant battle against the elements adds another layer of difficulty that simply doesn't exist to the same degree at Wimbledon's grass courts or Roland Garros clay. Another aspect Gauff finds crazy is the time difference and how disconnected the Australian Open can feel from the rest of the world. Playing matches while much of Europe and the United States are asleep creates a strange sense of isolation. Coco has mentioned that winning or losing a huge match in Melbourne can feel surreal because the immediate reaction from fans back home comes hours later. Social media explodes after the fact, not in real time, and that delay changes how emotions are processed. At the US Open, Coco has described feeling energy instantly, crowds roaring, phones buzzing, the world reacting in real time. In Australia, she says it can feel like you're competing in a bubble, where everything is intense but slightly removed from the rest of the tennis universe. For some players, that isolation helps them focus. For others, especially younger stars who feed off energy and momentum, it can feel strange and disorienting. Gauff has also highlighted the crowd dynamic as another major difference. Australian fans are famously passionate, knowledgeable, and respectful, but their energy is different from New York, Paris, or London. Coco has said the Australian Open crowd feels more relaxed, more festival-like, especially in the early rounds. There is a party atmosphere around Melbourne Park, with music, food, and fans enjoying the summer vibe. Compared to the tradition-heavy silence of Wimbledon or the intense, partisan atmosphere of the US Open, Australia feels like its own universe. What makes this especially crazy to Coco is how that relaxed vibe can suddenly flip into high drama. Night matches under the lights at Rod Laver Arena can be electric, and she's experienced moments where the crowd energy completely changes the momentum of a match. One minute it feels laid back, the next it's deafening. That unpredictability, she says, is something players constantly have to adjust to. Then there's the travel. The Australian Open is the furthest Grand Slam for most players, and Coco has been candid about how long the journey feels, both physically and mentally. By the time players arrive, deal with jet lag, media duties, practice schedules, and early round matches, it can feel like they've already been on a marathon before the tournament even begins. Gauff has said that by the time the Australian Open ends, it almost feels like the season has already taken a huge emotional toll, even though it's technically just getting started. In contrast, Wimbledon sits comfortably in the middle of the season, the French Open builds gradually on clay, and the US Open feels like a grand finale. Australia, in Coco's eyes, is chaotic in the best and worst ways, a massive, high-stakes event that arrives before players have had time to settle into the year. Coco has also talked about how mentally tough it is to lose early in Australia. Because it's the first slam, an early exit can feel like a heavy blow that lingers for months. She has explained that when you lose at the French Open or Wimbledon, there are immediate chances to bounce back. In Australia, a loss can leave players questioning their preparation, their form, and their mindset for the entire season ahead. That pressure, she says, makes every match feel disproportionately important. At the same time, she acknowledges that a deep run in Melbourne can set the tone for an incredible year. Confidence gained at the Australian Open can carry players through the spring, the summer, and beyond. That emotional swing, from crushing disappointment to soaring belief, is what makes the tournament feel so extreme. Despite calling it crazy, Coco Gauff has been clear that she loves the Australian Open. She respects its history, its innovation, and the way it treats players. She has praised the facilities, the organization, and the effort to prioritize athlete welfare, especially when it comes to heat policies and recovery options. Her comments aren't criticism, they're insight into how different this Grand Slam feels from the inside. As Coco continues to mature as a player and a leader on tour, her perspective carries more weight than ever. She's no longer just a rising star. She's a champion who understands the nuances of the sport at the highest level. When she talks about the Australian Open being crazy, she's giving fans a rare glimpse into the emotional and mental roller coaster that defines elite tennis. Her words also highlight something fans sometimes forget. Grand Slams are not just four big tournaments that look similar on TV. They are four completely different worlds, each demanding unique adjustments. Coco Gauff's honesty reminds us that even the best players in the world are constantly adapting, learning, and navigating challenges that go far beyond hitting a tennis ball. As the next Australian Open approaches, Coco's comments add an extra layer of intrigue. Will she use that chaos to her advantage? Will her growing experience help her master what she once found overwhelming? One thing is certain: when Coco Gauff steps onto the court in Melbourne, she does so with a deeper understanding of just how wild, demanding, and unforgettable the Australian Open truly is. And that's why her perspective matters. Because when one of the game's biggest stars tells us what feels crazy behind the scenes, it brings us closer to the reality of professional tennis, and reminds us why these Grand Slam moments mean so much, not just to fans, but to the players living them.